HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The False Promise of Superiority, The United States and Nuclear Deterrence After the Cold War, by James H. Lebovic, read by David Stifel. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. I finished this book at a painfully difficult time in world history. After invading Ukraine, Russian forces are leveling that country, backed by a Russian president who aspires to redraw state boundaries across Europe, with his threats to escalate beyond conventional force use. A nuclear conflict between the United States and Russia remains a realistic possibility. These developments test much of what we know, or think we know, about nuclear deterrence and the robustness of the international order that grew from the wreckage of the last World War. As history unfolds, I hope that listeners can dismiss these claims as the alarmist fears of an author who was too close to events to view them in appropriate perspective. Chapter 1. The United States and Nuclear Deterrence After the Cold War. Contemporary scholars engage in fanciful thinking about U.S. nuclear superiority. Perhaps this is understandable. Even Cold War-era policymakers flirted with strategies and technologies to mitigate the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons use. Both the strategies and the technologies seem more viable now that the United States apparently enjoys quantitative and qualitative nuclear advantages over contenders. Yet these advantages are largely illusionary. Try as it might, the United States cannot escape oppressive facts and possibilities that govern war and peace in the nuclear age. During the Cold War, international politics theorists devoted much thought to how, where, when, and why to employ nuclear weapons. They were inspired in part by nuclear strategists who battled in the great debates of the period. Where some strategists saw threats to deterrence, others did not. Where some envisioned solutions, others feared grave threats to the stability of U.S.-Soviet relations. They were not alone in their skepticism. Proposals that often shined in the abstract tarnished significantly under social scientific scrutiny. The ideas that enthralled Cold War-era strategists resonate in the works of contemporary scholars, who, in their focus on U.S. nuclear superiority, reveal the same biases and blind spots. Consequently, they highlight capability asymmetries or improvements that only promise to override undesirable deterrence constraints. And they accept too readily that coercive bargaining tactics can compensate rather than worsen conditions when capability alone appears insufficient. In this, they fail to attend to an underlying reality: assumptions about adversary intent, conjectures influenced by political, social, psychological, and organizational factors will determine how the parties act in a conflict, and whether they seek to avoid one. Too often, however, these assumptions are buried in policy justifications and analysis. There, they hide from needed criticism. Superiority by implication in current policy debates. We might dismiss nuclear superiority as an oxymoron, the fanciful obsession of a select few who, with the distance that think tanks and universities afford, inhabit the abstract world of assumption. But we must take the concept seriously. Beyond its seductive appeal, it continues to impact scholarly writings, policy planning, and government rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons. Of course, recent signs of the concept's appeal, the nonsensical bluster of Donald Trump's presidency, are admittedly hard to take seriously. Trump's unschooled fascination with the power of the atom, subject exclusively to his command, reduced the credibility of all claims related to the use of nuclear weapons. Trump opined about nuking hurricanes, and he bragged about obliterating Afghanistan, presumably with nuclear weapons, winning nuclear arms races, and the relative size of his nuclear button. That button only seemed bigger when Trump proclaimed the U.S. development of a super-duper missile that dwarfed its rivals in performance. In his words, "You take the fastest missile we have right now. You've heard Russia has 5 times, and China is working on 5 or 6 times. We have won 17 times, and it's just gotten the go-ahead." Lost on him was that the math did not make the United States at least 3 times more powerful than its competitors. Indeed, his rhetorical record, as when he advocated a 10-fold increase in the U.S. nuclear stockpile, countering decades of movement toward a smaller, more efficient arsenal, provides no clear sense of whether or not the United States enjoys nuclear superiority, or even what that requires. The musings of a living straw man thwart serious discussion and debate, but even Trump's words mean something. They appealed to Trump, and thus presumably appealed also to the like-minded percentage of the U.S. population that knew and cared little about international affairs, and believed that U.S. global challenges stemmed largely from weak U.S. leadership. Even if not taken literally, Trump's words reflected a cavalier embrace of nuclear weapons and a false sense of immunity from the disastrous effects of a nuclear conflict. More problematically, such words, in some dressed-up form, continue to influence planners and strategists who see danger and opportunity arising from new technologies and bigger arsenals. Arms control was among the casualties then, when the George W. Bush administration formally withdrew in 2002 from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, giving Russia and China reason to increase their nuclear force capabilities. And decades later, when the Trump administration withdrew from the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, a crowning achievement of Cold War-era arms control, ostensibly to counter a Russian and Chinese push to acquire intermediate-range missiles. Efforts to build on the force reductions of the Obama administration's New START Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty agreement languished as administrations sought new nuclear weapons, cruise missiles and low-yield warheads, and new weapon applications. Whereas the George W. Bush administration's Nuclear Posture Review, NPR, broadened the list of potential U.S. nuclear targets to include biological and chemical weapon targets, an option scaled back in the NPR of the Obama administration to exclude parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in compliance with their nuclear non-proliferation obligations. The Trump administration's 2018 NPR sanctioned a possible nuclear response to foreign cyber attacks on the U.S. infrastructure. As presidential candidate, Joe Biden promised a retraction. He embraced deterrence and retaliation for a nuclear attack as the sole purpose of nuclear weapons. As president, however, he demurred. The 2022 NPR adopted a less restrictive position, accepting these missions as the fundamental purpose of nuclear weapons, which harked back to Obama-era standards in allowing for the first use of nuclear weapons. The United States is obviously not the sole culprit here. In 2018, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced 5 new technologies designed to penetrate U.S. defenses before adding another the following year. Indeed, Russia, despite its Cold War-era no-first-use policy, professed plans to employ the country's nuclear forces in various non-nuclear contingencies. Revisions in Russian military doctrine permit the use of tactical nuclear weapons to augment the depleted Russian conventional force. Thus, Putin's 2022 claim to have alerted Russian nuclear forces and Russia's thinly veiled threats of a global nuclear war in response to NATO's support for Ukraine after its invasion by Russia raised the risk of a nuclear conflagration as in no time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. For its part, China, which long maintained a relatively small nuclear force for deterrence, is expanding and diversifying its nuclear arsenal, fueling calls for a U.S. response. The U.S. Department of Defense, reminiscent of its glossy Soviet military power report of the Cold War years, now shines its light on military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China, implying at least that China's larger and more diverse nuclear capabilities are potential game changers in the U.S.-China nuclear relationship. Predictably, perhaps, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General John Hyten dubbed the Chinese hypersonic missile a first strike weapon that could give China the capability to launch a surprise attack on the United States. Yet looming adversary deployments are not necessarily cause for U.S. nuclear offsets. Rather than fret about what adversaries could do with their weapons, we should ask what they would do given U.S. retaliatory assets, which limit gains relative to costs from an attack. The failure to look beyond weapons or their threatened use reflects a pervasive blindness. It requires a careful look at the assumptions behind past U.S. nuclear strategies, as bequeathed now to the present. Nuclear superiority, in theory. For one high-profile scholar, Matthew Kronig, U.S. nuclear superiority is real. The relative advantages that the United States enjoys in sheer numbers of warheads could pay off in a strategy of brinkmanship. The United States can take other countries to the edge of war knowing that they will back down. For other scholars, Kierlieber and Darrell Press most notably, the United States had or will soon obtain nuclear primacy. It could then disarm its most powerful nuclear adversaries, Russia and China, in a first strike. What should we make of these concepts? At first glance, superiority seems the more politically charged of the two terms. In Kronig's analysis, it appears to flaunt relative U.S. nuclear power. Yet in principle, superiority could apply only to a subset of units. Then, superiority relative to some party or state could mean inferiority compared to others. Kronig himself softens the term by using it synonymously with advantage. The term suggests then, albeit not by his reading, that U.S. adversaries possess or could acquire offsetting or neutralizing advantages. By contrast, primacy assumes that the United States stands as the one and only at the top of the heap, though Lieber and Press equivocate more than Kronig does on the implications. In their view, U.S. primacy might give the United States a coercive edge, but it could also fuel instability. Indeed, both Russia and China have sought to build up their nuclear forces to offset an apparent U.S. advantage. Thus, these scholars view the coercive and political implications of the U.S. nuclear position with greater uncertainty. Still, the two concepts are similarly limited. They wrongly attribute influence more to relative nuclear capabilities than to the contesting parties' intentions. These immediate and long-term goals are shaped by the parties' beliefs about the likely course of war and evaluation of the costs and benefits of acting or not acting, based in part on assumptions about each other's objectives. We undercut the impact of terms like superiority and primacy, then, When we concede that the United States would use nuclear weapons only under truly exceptional conditions, or that the weakest of nuclear powers still presents a potential nuclear threat to the United States in a conflict. The conflating of capability with influence remains problematic when strategists employ seemingly less loaded terms in making the case for a robust or flexible nuclear force. As Keith Payne puts it, having a spectrum of deterrence options and focusing on threat credibility seem only prudent in the contemporary threat environment, given the diversity of opponents and their nuclear threats, the potential variability of their decision-making, and the range of possible deterrence goals. With these options, the United States can presumably tailor U.S. deterrence to the unique, extreme, or opaque goals of a potential challenger, or match the U.S. response to the level at which it occurs. With the language of preparedness, we still travel the same road, thinking that influence comes from the barrel of a gun. The answer to nuclear challenges remains more weapons of greater varieties and more places to plug deterrence holes or to fill gaps where they might unexpectedly arise. As we shall learn, however, these straightforward solutions should invite great skepticism. Claims of superiority, by any name, rest on questionable math, dubious assumptions about how a nuclear conflict might unfold, and insufficient regard for the aversions of the parties, and conditions that increase or limit restraint. The Cold War roots of contemporary thinking. Cold War-era analysts fought hard over the requisites of deterrence, the significance and insignificance of nuclear advantages, and the implications of each for policy. Their disagreements yielded sharply contrasting interpretations of the same evidence and episodes. In the lore of the era, the Cuban Missile Crisis emerged as a defining moment, indeed a parable of sorts. The nuclear powers had danced on the precipice of incineration and lived to tell the tale. For some analysts, the message was, "Stick to your guns, the big and the little ones." For others it was, "Act decisively but seek a way out." With time, the core arguments gained nuance and attention through innovative wrinkles. The competing arguments reduced nonetheless to simple premises. Hawks saw a world in which states achieved peace through strength. They thus advised U.S. policymakers to anticipate, answer, and preferably best Soviet nuclear acquisitions, and ensure that the Soviets understood that the United States was prepared, if necessary, to use its nuclear weapons. Doves maintained, instead, that deterrence was secure because the United States and Soviet Union shared an aversion to nuclear war. The United States and Soviet Union were like two scorpions in a bottle. Each feared striking the other, because either, though mortally wounded, could inflict a fatal sting. Doves thus spread the word that a U.S.-Soviet nuclear exchange would assuredly result in mutual catastrophe, what, in the Cold War period, was widely known as mutual assured destruction, or MAD. While seeking to maintain a unilateral U.S. retaliatory posture, assured destruction that would intentionally produce that catastrophe. They recognized, however, that policymakers could lose control of events in times of crisis. They advised U.S. policymakers to maintain open channels of communication, leave room to maneuver, dutifully consider options, and avoid knee-jerk reactions to events. Hawks did not all subscribe to the same view. Some sought plans and weapons that would permit the United States to fight wars, as traditionally understood. Other hawks accepted that MAD might occur, but fought its dire implications. To boost deterrence, they hoped to convince the Soviets that the United States had retaliatory options short of triggering catastrophe. If war occurred, they expected to ply these options coercively to convince the Soviets to back down. Yet doves also differed in their individual views. Some thought the mere existence of nuclear weapons proscribed nuclear war. Even a small number of nuclear weapons, given their catastrophic effects, could deter a nuclear attack. Others rejected the principles of such existential deterrence and pushed for nuclear capabilities in huge quantities, adherents of the so-called assured destruction position aimed directly at Soviet cities, to reinforce the message that nothing good could come from a nuclear exchange. We could certainly question their dovish credentials. Perhaps they were doves only when compared to hawks. Their dovishness stemmed, however, from an overriding belief that both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized they would suffer prohibitively in a nuclear exchange. Things obviously get messy conceptually, then, when placing viewpoints into distinct boxes. They get messier still when recognizing that many analysts accepted the essential logic of assured destruction, but looked to ensure against catastrophe by relying on the nuclear capabilities and tactics that enthralled some hawks. We can be forgiven, then, if we place the assertions of many Cold War-era theorists into a box marked nebulous middle. Those in the group would share basic assumptions: that the U.S.-Soviet nuclear deterrence relationship was stable, that all-out nuclear war would be catastrophic, and that the United States needed options in capabilities and tactics to reinforce deterrence and avoid the worst should deterrence fail. We would likely disagree, however, over whether certain theorists were more dove than hawk or more hawk than dove. We can profit then when we move beyond simplistic labels like hawk and dove to appreciate the full logic and illogic of past and current nuclear debates, but also in recognizing preoccupations that have always afflicted thinking about deterrence. These long-standing biases, centered in capabilities and tactics, undergird contemporary beliefs that the United States can overcome traditional challenges to either impose its will or coerce adversaries to achieve favorable outcomes. Deference to capabilities. Despite rivalries among Cold War-era analysts and the unforgiving rhetoric of arcane policy debates, the protagonists shared a basic assumption. For most nuclear analysts, the essence of deterrence and its confounding challenges lay in the phenomenal destructiveness of nuclear weapons. Whereas doves tended to see security in the massive amount of capability, on land, in the air, and at sea, that the United States could deliver, hawks imposed a more exacting standard. They sought security in numbers of U.S. warheads available per Soviet targets, the relative damage that U.S. and Soviet arsenals could inflict, the size of the U.S. arsenal vis-à-vis its traditional levels, and so forth. They warned that various gaps of advantage and openings and loopholes in arms control agreements favored the Soviets should they launch an unprovoked strike on U.S. nuclear forces. Going even further, some hawks argued that the Soviets had engineered these unfavorable asymmetries to coerce the West and profit at some point from an actual attack. The Soviets would presumably strike because they read victory into ratios of advantage, whatever costs a nuclear war would bring. Denial strategies thus took shape in the 1960s and 1970s, and gained force in reaction to the mainstreaming of assured destruction principles, which centered instead on punishing the Soviets should they launch a nuclear strike. Denial proponents emphasized not the imposing of costs, but rather acquiring the capabilities necessary to deny an adversary benefits from an attack. They posed a simple question with a seemingly obvious answer. Why would an adversary strike if it had nothing to gain? In their thinking, that question acquired urgency from a related one. What could the United States gain from carrying through on its deterrence threat? They expressed fears that stability then, at the level of an all-out nuclear exchange, might induce instability at some lesser level. The stability-instability paradox, as it was called, reflected concern in particular that with robust Soviet nuclear capabilities, the United States could not deter a Soviet conventional attack on Western Europe. Some analysts, henceforth soft war fighters, saw, in the irksome scenario, reason to develop limited options with the hope of controlling and stemming the march to an all-out nuclear war. Other analysts committed fully to a denial strategy. These hard war fighters feared that the Soviets had positioned themselves militarily to seize the initiative when the time was right. They would then violate arms control agreements by outfitting their missiles with large number of warheads. They could coerce the United States from a position of strength, and might even launch a disarming nuclear offensive against the U.S. homeland. From this perspective, Soviet risks were virtually irrelevant. The United States had no rational reason to impose costs in retaliation. A legacy of the Cold War remains today in thinking about the use and threatened use of nuclear weapons. All such thinking begs the essential Cold War-era question: what would a state gain, and what would it lose from an actual attack? The question is sidestepped, however, as analysts focus on materiel issues, the number, nature, and positioning of weapons systems, more than the contesting parties' intentions, and how they might change due to political, social, psychological, and organizational influences over the course of a nuclear confrontation. These influences will determine a party's level of uncertainty, propensity for risk-taking, valuation of wartime costs, and all the rest that determine what leaders seek and how and when they pursue it. Deference to tactics. Analysts did not rely on nuclear capability-based reasoning alone. In drawing from works in strategy and bargaining, they sought to reinforce, augment, and close gaps in deterrence theorizing. Whereas a first wave of theorists, Bernard Brodie preeminent among them, grappled with the revolutionary impact of nuclear weapons on global politics and warfare, a second wave of theorists of the late 50s and early 60s, Thomas Schelling, Herman Kahn, Glenn Snyder, Albert Wohlstetter, and others, provided the concepts and theoretical underpinnings for much of our thinking about nuclear deterrence. As a group, these analysts highlighted the paradoxical nature of deterrence, in which each side hopes to gain security, not by being able to protect itself, but by threatening to inflict unacceptable damage on the other. They thereby acknowledged the seemingly incongruous logic of deterrence applied to parties with a second strike capability, which permits them to retaliate with devastating force whatever the size and nature of an adversary first strike. By this logic, a party, if attacked, essentially threatens to blow itself up by launching a suicidal retaliatory strike against the attacker. Thus, these theorists supposed that nuclear stability might require tactical support. The United States somehow had to convince the Soviets that the United States would deliver on its threat if attacked. They saw a need then to make commitments, manipulate risks, establish resolve, and build reputations for acting to overcome deficiencies that might undermine deterrence. It was left to a third wave of theorists to acknowledge and test the influence of various political, sociological, psychological, and organizational factors on deterrence relationships. The mechanisms of credibility enhancement, commitment, risk manipulation, resolve, and reputation remained central to the research enterprise. Third-wave theorists stressed the dangers of over- and under-reliance, however, on these concepts. Whereas capability-based analyses too often ignored adversary intent or red intent, broad purposes, goals, or motives into capability balances and imbalances.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?